Hello and welcome to another of PAVE's weekly virtual panels. My name is Ed Niedermeyer. I'm the communications director here at Partners for Automated Vehicle Education. I'm particularly excited about this week's panel, in large part because it's about a job I used to do, and it features some folks who I think have a really interesting seat on the world of autonomous vehicles and driving automation technology more broadly. And I'm really excited that they're here today to share some of that perspective with us so that you might understand sort of how your autonomous vehicle news sausage gets made and by whom. So joining me today for our panel that goes behind the bylines, I'm joined by Tanya Snyder. She's a transportation reporter for POLITICO. Tanya, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
And Andrew Hawkins, he is the transportation editor at theverge.com. Welcome, Andrew. So great to have you both. I wanted to start out for just sort of helping people understand a little bit where you're coming from, right? There's a lot of different ways to cover AVs and angles and stories, and you both kind of have slightly different focuses within this broader world of driving automation technology. Tanya, I want to start with you. If you could just kind of give us maybe a little bit of background of how you kind of ended up in covering this sector, and I know, and then also like what else you cover, because I think for both of you this is part of a broader beat. Yeah, just a little bit of background about what you cover and sort of where automated vehicles fit into that.
Sure. So before I worked at POLITICO, I worked at Streets Blog, which many of you may know, which is an outlet that covers transportation from the point of view of sustainability, placemaking, urban planning, urban design, safe streets, making sure that streets are safe for all modes, not just cars, lowering emissions, all of that. And was very much partisan on that side. POLITICO is not partisan. POLITICO plays it much straighter, and also focuses very kind of tightly on politics and policy. So, a lot of the fun kind of whiz-bang technology stories that you can read in The Verge, you're not going to see on the pages of Politico Pro. But I started at Politico covering transportation again. I think the first event that I covered was Anthony Fox unveiling the first iteration of DOT driverless car guidance. So, and I've been doing it since then. Every time we sort of rejigger beats on my team, I try to, stick to surface transportation, safe streets, things like that. And I think AVs fit well within that. And I always try to give away the aviation stuff, which isn't really my world. So yeah, that's where I am.
Absolutely. And Andy, yeah, how did driving automation technology become part of your beat, and give us a little background on how you're approaching that?
Yeah, so this is actually sort of the second major beat that I've covered in my career as a journalist. I started out as a politics reporter covering New York City politics for a number of years for a bunch of different outlets like the New York Daily News and Crane's New York Business. And while I was at Crane's, actually, was when about the same time that Uber started making inroads in New York City and tussling with local regulators there and upending the taxi industry and getting, cease and desist letters sent to it by like the New York Attorney General. And I was like, oh, this company is interesting. So I got really deep into like covering Uber and sort of like how this like technology potentially was going to, at the time, what a lot of people thought was going to transform transportation. And that led me to The Verge. They were looking to cover Uber more closely, and so they hired me to cover ride-hailing apps. And from there, obviously, Uber famously declared that it was going to get into autonomous vehicles, and my beat sort of broadened. And I got really interested in covering self-driving cars and autonomous vehicles. I would say probably around like 2016 or so, which is when I felt like they started kind of going mainstream in a lot of ways. Waymo was created, and you saw a lot of like these mega deals from some of the major OEMs and automakers. And so it was very clear at that time that autonomous vehicles were going to be a big part of sort of the transportation world going forward. And so I really kind of drilled down at that point and tried to learn as much as I could about the technology and the beat.
Yeah, no, and one of the really cool things about autonomous vehicles is that because it is relatively new, people do come into it from lots of different backgrounds and bring a lot of really interesting perspectives to it. And like that's here at PAVE exactly what we're trying to empower with our education. But of course, at the same time, there are also barriers to entry, right? And it can be an intimidating topic to just kind of dive into. So one of the things I'm hoping you'll both be able to share is sort of some perspective on what were the initial challenges of kind of bringing this, again, very kind of daunting technology oftentimes into your beat, which had, as you know, in both your cases, sort of focused on other things and even not on technology specifically. So Tanya, what are your thoughts about those sort of initial barriers and how people can maybe overcome them?
I think those weren't just barriers for press. I mean, I think that you look at stakeholder reactions to this technology as it was coming out, and they've really flipped a lot. You know, the safety community was standing up there, you know, championing driverless cars. This is the future. This is going to save so many lives. And then has really become much more skeptical of the industry, of the technology, of the way that it's been deployed, and of the kinds of policies that the industry has been pushing for. So some alliances have changed there. The disability community similarly was very much in favor of all of the ways that this could be a game changer, especially for people with vision impairments, all kinds of disabilities, and has become a little bit disenchanted with the way that things have gone, with the way that their community has or hasn't been consulted or brought into designs or policymaking. So I think that everybody's been trying to figure this out, and regulators certainly have been trying to figure this out. So we trying to cover it need to make sure that we are representing all of those sides, all of the relevant sides, and what they're saying. And you know, we don't want to put a thumb on the scale, but we do want to provide some analysis, and we do want to, you know, call BS when there's BS. And sometimes it is hard to know. And I think that we have seen over the last couple of years, I think that, you know, 5 years ago, it was like, this is coming, this is almost here. And then there's been a really big lull since then.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, and I think to your point that need to kind of continually be reassessing and really learning, that, you know, there is no point at which you become an expert and you just have to, you know, stop learning, or you get to stop learning about this stuff. Andy, I'm curious about your thoughts about this as well, about sort of the challenges of taking this on as a subject for someone new to it, and how to sort of get some confidence in it.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, not a software engineer, have no experience in safety critical systems, have never worked in the automotive space. I've been a journalist my whole life, unfortunately. So coming into covering the story, you know, I really leaned a lot on experts in the field. I think initially talking to people who not only were developing this technology and operating it in the field, but also the folks that, you know, like Tanya mentioned, the people who could stand to benefit, people in the disability community, you know, people who lack access to transportation. And I think that that really kind of helped guide me, I think, in sort of the early years, getting to learn more about how this technology worked. And I really got to hand it, I mean, I think like a lot of people, you know, it can be daunting because it is highly complex. You're talking about, you know, things like machine learning, artificial intelligence, sensor capabilities, all of these technologies that have not really played a significant role in transportation, and especially in the automotive world, I think, until like the last 10 years or so. And so there was like I think probably a lot of confusion, I think, especially in the early years, about, you know, how we should be sort of defining what we're talking about and how we could best explain this technology and how it's being deployed and how it was unfolding in sort of the real world to you know, a mass market audience, to people who are not experts, who are looking for more information about how this technology was potentially going to impact their own lives. And, you know, I think like, I look back at some of my old stories and sometimes I cringe a little bit about how you know, I talk about this, I talk about this stuff, but I feel like over time, It's hopefully gotten better, and I feel like I've gotten a little bit more confidence in terms of covering this space and learning about it from the people who are really sort of working, up close and personal with it. So that's been really helpful. People's, my sources and their sort of willingness to sort of take a step back and explain things from a layman's perspective, which is obviously what us as journalists need to do. We need to take these complex subjects and sort of distill them and explain them in as easy a way as possible. A lot of people will say in journalism, you have to really write it at like a 4th grade level a lot of times in order to ensure that as many people can read and understand what you're trying to say. And I think it's even more of a challenge when you're talking about super complex technology like this.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, this leads to another thing I wanted to get into, which is sort of your audience, because I think a lot of times it's sort of the question of, what is it that people are wanting to know and looking for, in information about AV, like how are people relating to it? And Tanya, you write for Politico, so I think people maybe have a sense of who your audience is, but I also want to work in another question as well into this because it's relevant. It came from one of our attendees, and I thought it was just a great question, which is like, what's the kind of news that makes you, sit up and pay attention, right? That seems like it's going to be impactful for your audience. And then, what does that maybe say about your audience and what they're interested in here?
Yeah. So my audience is wonks and policy people. It's people on and off the Hill, in agencies, on K Street, in nonprofits, people who are trying to influence policy, right policy. So that is I think probably pretty different from Andrew's core audience, although I'm sure there's overlap. In terms of what kind of stories are most interesting to me, everybody likes a counterintuitive headline. Everybody likes this thing that you thought isn't true. You were wrong about this. Even better if it's John Thune was wrong about this or Debbie Dingle was wrong about this. So something that takes readers kind of behind the into the black box. So much of policymaking, so much of technology as well happens in a black box. It can be very opaque. It can be very hard to get behind that. It can be very hard to feel like you're getting behind kind of talking points and promotional speech. And to really bring people in there and show a juicy conflict or something where, okay, so John Thune is wrong about this, or Debbie Dingle is wrong about this, right? So, they're wrong. So what's right? So what's the, bringing in sort of a conflict, kind of bringing, calling public figures to account for, things that they're getting wrong, and then, proposing solutions or conveying some ideas about solutions. I think all of that would be a pretty juicy story for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And Andy, I mean, I feel like with a more kind of general audience, like this question gets really kind of challenging, right? I have to imagine. Share your perspective with us.
Yeah, so I feel like the Verge's general audience are like people who are interested in like consumer technology. Sort of our core, purpose is to, in addition to sort of covering the technology industry and sort of like the products that it produces. And we've been broadening recently to look into like labor issues and, sort of privacy concerns and cybersecurity. But at the core, we're a consumer technology website, people who want to know what the best phone is to buy. So it's conceivable that at some point in the future, I'll be writing a story about here are the top 10 autonomous vehicles that you should be purchasing. Maybe not in the next decade or so, maybe in the next 50 years, who knows? But I certainly approach it from the perspective of a consumer technology. This is something that we're not just working on as a science experiment. It's for the purposes of actually being deployed and used in a commercial capacity. Waymo wants to make money. Argo, Cruise, all of these companies, they want to make money off of these autonomous vehicles. And so how are they going to do that? What is going to be sort of the way that they get people into their cars? How is this going to be a meaningful addition to our transportation network? How is it going to impact it? And so definitely tracking that sort of over time has been really interesting. In terms of like what's a juicy story for us. I think like initially it was definitely experiential stuff. So testing out the vehicles myself, riding in them, writing about sort of what the experience was like and who are the people that are working on it, and sort of, I'm taking a self-driving car through downtown San Francisco. What happens? Who does it encounter? How does it react? That was definitely something initially, I think, that our audience was really interested in. And now that we've sort of like passed that initial phase of like, oh, here, cool, it's a self-driving car, that's so fascinating. And there's, I think, we're sort of getting into now the trough of disillusionment, or maybe we're coming out of the trough of disillusionment. I'll leave that for others to decide. But I think it's also about how the companies are sort of independently verifying their claims that they're making in terms of the safety case for autonomous vehicles. And that's why I think, like, for instance, some of the recent stories that I've written that I think are really important are like companies like Waymo that are taking, I think the extra step that's necessary to publish findings that, give more information to the public. A lot of times, Tanya, I think you pointed out this as well, things can be a black box. It can be hard to sort of see beyond sort of the glossy marketing materials that a lot of these companies put out, or sort of like the positive spin on the press announcements that they make. If they actually just present folks with the raw data in terms of what their vehicles will mean in terms of road safety, I think that that's really significant and can help make the case through the press to the public that this is actually a technology that could significantly improve safety and reduce the amount of crashes and deaths that take place, which, as we all know, is catastrophically high right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, yeah, the industry does talk a lot about earning public trust, but as you say, I mean, that's something that has to be earned, and that's something where you're sort of between these companies and the public to some extent, and it's your job as journalists, in large part, to make sure that when companies are saying things that they are earning trust, you kind of fact checking that and validating that, and so I'm wondering, again, because it's such a as Tanya said, it oftentimes seems like a black box, but technologically and in a lot of different ways, how do you go about sort of validating what these companies are saying, and what are some of your techniques or approaches to that, and do you have to, are there limits to that? Sometimes do we just have to kind of take things on trust? Tanya.
I was going to pitch that over to Andrew first.
Well, Andrew, if you want to take it first too, that's fine. Yeah.
No, I think the example that I gave of that what Waymo is doing in terms of publishing some of its some of the data from its its the testing that it's been doing in Arizona, and sort of the limited customer facing ride-hailing product that they have operating, sort of the taxi service that they're operating there, I think is a really great first step, and I hope that some of the other companies will sort of take that to heart. And I think all the companies have been sort of doing I think a pretty decent job in terms of not in addition to like sort of the announcements that they make about we were doing this trial run in Texas with this logistics operator, or we're launching in a new testing program in a new city. They're also doing a lot in terms of communications. I'm thinking of like what Argo does with its Ground Truth website, which Ed, your buddy Alex has a lot to do with. I think that's a really great example of ways that companies in some respects, yes, you need to look at it with like a grain of salt. It is still coming out of a company that eventually wants to be a profitable one and make money off of this, and so they obviously have a stake in presenting things as positively as possible. But I do think that there is something to be said for the amount of data that the companies are putting out into the hands of researchers that I think will inevitably lead to more confidence in the technology, that it is being handled appropriately, and it will be rolled out in a safe fashion. And sort of straying away from like sort of the glossy marketing stuff and more in sort of the hard data that can be verified using the old scientific method, peer review and all the things that make a difference in terms of efficacy and public trust.
Yeah, Tanya, I don't know. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think for me, I'm more looking at and trying to validate or evaluate or analyze policy than technology, and that's a little easier. I mean, you can tell, first of all, by the stakeholders lined up for and against something, and that's true with the technology as well. That you might not be able to independently verify this, but when people that you respect and trust are coming out and saying there's a problem here, you listen to them. And in terms of policy as well, you see, I think it can be a little bit less challenging to get into something like, should cities and states be able to make their own policies regarding AV testing and deployment, or what should NHTSA be doing in terms of Tesla's full self-driving deployment or the misuse of autopilot? What are some of all of those? What makes sense in terms of exemption caps? Like, is that something that's necessary? Is that something? And then the AV companies' claims come into that as well, because when you talk about the necessity of massive increases in the exemption cap, you can balance that alongside the fact that these cars are not coming out as quickly as some had hoped a couple of years ago. So I think that what I'm trying to evaluate and validate is a little bit different, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to turn to sort of one of the kind of pressing issues for us here at PAVE in terms of public education, and that's the confusion that we see out in the public, both in survey data and certainly anecdotally. The confusion that the public seems to have around the difference between an autonomous vehicle and some of the driver assistance systems that are available on cars today. Obviously we care a lot about this because it's an educational issue, but there are also real, there seem to be real safety sort of implications to some of it. I would love to get both of you to kind of share your view of that issue, maybe sort of where you think like observations about it as a phenomenon, and then maybe sort of some thoughts on what's the media's role and responsibility in all this. And we'll start with Andy.
Yeah, I think I was mentioning this a little bit beforehand, but in my early days of covering this technology, I was very much guilty of conflating all sorts of different things that I now see are very, very different from one another. I was very fast and loose with my terminology, describing things as alternately, self-driving, autonomous, driverless, partially automated, semi-autonomous, all the various terms that we now know are helping to contribute to the sort of the general confusion that exists out there. And I think it's also the case that, looking at things from the perspective of just your average person who maybe is not following all of this as closely as all of us, they're not going to, be able to parse the difference, I think, for the most part. If they get into their Tesla and they see a product called full self-driving, and lo and behold, it, stops at stop signs and performs automated turning and does all of these things that, in their mind is what an autonomous vehicle does, why shouldn't they assume that it's the same as what, any of the other companies are doing? And so I think it is going to be, I think, a real challenge for not only for the companies themselves, the ones who are going to be marketing their services to customers, but also for educators and advocacy organizations such as PAVE, for the media like Tanya and myself, for policymakers. I was interviewing Pete Buttigieg recently, and this was something that he was definitely, you could tell, like he was getting agitated because I kept asking him about Tesla and full self-driving, and he was getting a little bit more annoyed about it. And he was just like, listen, I'm going to be saying this until I'm blue in the face. AVs are not the same thing as ADAS and vice versa. And that's going to be, I think, a real important thing, I think, where I think a lot of like the consumer publications like The Verge, and I think Consumer Reports has been doing a really good job. I think smart reporters like Tanya and others know the difference of this. And I think hopefully over time, you'll start to see people sort of getting, the distinctions between these things. But while it remains, that ADAS is going to become more of a prominent feature in a lot of production cars, AVs still sort of remain kind of elusive in terms of like a commercial sense. There's going to be confusion until you start to see more widespread adoption and more more people actually riding in autonomous vehicles and seeing the difference themselves with their own eyes.
Yeah, absolutely. And Tanya, I want to get your thoughts on this as well. And I want to kind of add the layer of, do you think that your audience of sort of policy-oriented, DC folks, is it, is it more important to address some of these misunderstandings because that's the audience, or is it less important in the sense that maybe you think they might be a little better educated about it? Really curious about your thoughts on this issue.
I think it's important that they understand it, whether they understand it because they read me or they read it someplace else or they figured it out some other way. It's important that they understand it if they're going to be making policy around this or advocating for policies around this. In terms of the jargon and the nomenclature, for a long time, I wasn't even allowed to use, DOT was using highly automated, most people were using autonomous. My editors thought that was all jargon, and people understand driverless, self-driving, and driverless, and that was all I was allowed to use. And so that was all I used for a long time, and I finally petitioned for permission to use autonomous. But I still think highly automated is jargon. But I think that we have figured out, and I think that it's not just, again, this whole industry is so new. And the scholarship around it, the policymaking around it is so new that we are figuring these things out. And when you have companies that are so intentionally conflating the boundary between ADAS and AV and saying that they're one when they're clearly the other, then it of course it's confusing. And I think that you've had a lot of the more conservative actors in the space really trying to distance themselves from Tesla, just rejecting some of the language, rejecting, and really putting out a call and asking media specifically to be clear in how they talk about these things. And I think that that's a call that we need to heed.
Yeah, absolutely. And Andy had a great story. I'll plug Andy in the Verge today about this sort of rebrand of a major industry group around autonomous instead of self-driving. So you're absolutely right. You are seeing that. And to stay on this sort of general topic for just a moment longer, and I'll start with you, Tanya. Are there things that PAVE could be doing to kind of help journalists either make sure that they're not making mistakes or that they're able to get the information they need, and just sort of generally supporting journalists in sort of their job of getting the facts to the general public? Because certainly from our perspective as PAVE, we see ourselves as kind of in a similar, different, but similar ultimate goals, which is getting facts to the public in a way that they can understand it. So if there's any ways that PAVE can support journalists in that effort, we definitely want to hear about that. Tanya?
Well, I love this question. How can we help you is always the best question. Yeah, I mean, when we're missing something, either because we put something out that is, conflating things that we shouldn't be conflating, or, that we get something wrong, flagging that for us. But certainly if there's something that that's going on that you haven't read first in our pages, let us know. Letting us know if there's, this is what everybody's talking about, and there's a lot of disagreement about X thing, or this thing is coming down the pike, or it's supposed to be coming down the pike and it's not, or there are things that are going on in the background that sometimes you don't really notice when they get to a point where it's a story. Or that I might not be plugged into. And so even just sort of those conflicts and conversations that are happening among stakeholders and industry folks are all interesting and useful and great for me to know about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I see we are getting close to time, but Andy, I really want to give you the last word on this one, because we genuinely do want to know as much as we can about how to support the work that you do, because it is really difficult. I know this from personal experience. So yeah.
Yeah, my DMs are open. Feel free to reach out to me with any pitches in terms of good stories that you think. I'm down for anything. I love stories about this technology, the unsung heroes who are doing amazing work, the folks who are maybe crossing the line in terms of what's safe and what's not safe. You know, calling out I think the good stuff that's out there, and also letting folks know when there's like misinformation and bad reporting too, I think is also helpful. So feel free to reach out anytime, pitch us stuff. Yeah, because we wouldn't be able to do anything that we do without our sources, and the sources that actually know, that work in the industry. I just want to mention, I think like one of the more interesting stories that I've written in recent years was not even based on like what the engineers and the C-suite executives are doing, but it's the folks in the operations teams that are working on some of these autonomous vehicle fleets in some of the cities. Their perspective, I think, is something that we don't hear enough of. And I think it's really fascinating because they're the ones who have their hands on the technology on a daily basis. They're working in the vehicle depots in the various cities. And I'd really like to hear from more of those folks as well. I think it's important to tell their story.
Absolutely. Well, I could easily have continued this conversation for at least twice as much time. This is always so fascinating to hear from the folks who are covering AVs out there every day. I want to thank both of our guests so much for being here today. Andrew Hawkins from The Verge, thank you so much.
Thank you guys so much. It was great.
And Tanya Snyder from POLITICO. Tanya, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks. It was a lot of fun.